Claire's first day at the base wasn't memorable for most of the recruits, but for her, it marked the beginning of something she had already endured countless times, proving herself in silence. She wasn't the loudest, the fastest, or the youngest. She didn't boast about family military traditions or parade her background like a badge. Instead, she stepped off the bus with one item that drew every eye before she even set foot in the barracks: a battered, rusted ammo box. It looked old enough to belong in a museum. The paint had faded to a dull mottled green, chipped along the edges and streaked with scratches that told stories only she understood. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, and the latch creaked when she carried it, almost as if complaining about the weight of its secrets. By the time she crossed the courtyard, whispers had already begun. "What is that thing?" one recruit muttered, elbowing his friend. "Probably keeps her diary in there," another snickered. "Looks like trash she dug out of a junkyard," a third added. Claire heard them all, though she gave no sign. Her face was calm, expression neutral, her step steady. She kept the box close, almost like it was part of her uniform. That first night in the barracks, the mocking grew louder. One recruit, a lanky 18-year-old named Peters, leaned against his bunk and pointed. "Hey, Grandma, what's in the treasure chest? Cookies? Love letters?" Laughter followed, bouncing off the metal bunks and concrete walls. Claire ignored him, setting the box neatly under her bed, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Her silence only encouraged them. The days that followed cemented her reputation, not for her skills, not for her discipline, but for the strange object she carried. During morning drills, she lugged the box along, tucking it safely by the sidelines before jogging into formation. During weapons maintenance, she kept it locked at her feet, as though daring someone to touch it. At the mess hall, she placed it at the end of the bench, balancing her tray beside it. To the recruits, it was bizarre. To Claire, it was instinct. One afternoon, while the group cleaned their rifles, Peters spoke up again. "Seriously, what's in the magic box?" "Don't tell me it's your lunch." His buddies laughed. Another chimed in. "I bet she doesn't even know how to shoot. That thing's just her way of looking mysterious." Claire's hands kept working, cloth sliding smoothly across the barrel of her M4. She didn't look up, didn't blink. Her discipline unnerved a few, though most just saw it as weakness. Someone who won't defend herself, they figured, must not have much to defend. But Claire wasn't quiet because she was afraid. She was quiet because words had no value where she had been. She had learned long ago that boasting meant little when bullets cracked overhead, and silence was often the difference between life and death. Her rusted ammo box wasn't for show. Inside, carefully protected from dust and moisture, were laminated certificates, records of achievements, years of training, and skills that none of these fresh recruits had yet touched. They thought it was junk. To her, it was proof. Proof of nights spent on frozen ranges, of sweat-soaked drills and blistering deserts, of patience learned the hard way. Proof that she had already walked further down this path than any of them realized. Still, she said nothing. The ridicule intensified. By the second week, the ammo box had become a running joke. Recruits would whisper as she passed, inventing wild guesses about its contents. "She keeps her teddy bear in there." "No, it's her retirement plan scrap metal." "Maybe she's hiding snacks." The laughter stung, not because Claire cared about their opinions, but because of what it revealed, the arrogance of those who hadn't yet been tested. She remembered her first deployment overseas, how silence meant survival, how stillness in the grass for hours could be the only way to complete a mission. Those lessons had carved themselves into her bones. These recruits had no idea. They had never had to count heartbeats while waiting for the perfect shot. They had never shouldered the weight of watching over their team from a distance, knowing one mistake could cost lives. To them, the box was a curiosity. To her, it was history. During a weapons inspection, Sergeant Miller, a gruff man with 20 years in, noticed the box. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He had seen that look before, the way Claire's hand never strayed far from it, the way her eyes sharpened when someone reached too close. He didn't press. Experience taught him that some soldiers carried scars in silence, and sometimes objects told their stories better than words. But the recruits weren't like Miller. They were young, restless, eager to prove themselves by tearing others down. Claire was an easy target, older, quieter, detached. The ammo box became their tool to chip at her composure, though none of them ever succeeded. At night, when the lights went out, Claire would lie awake, the soft creak of the barracks settling around her. She'd think of the names etched in her memory, the ones who hadn't come back. She'd think of the shots that had landed true, and the ones that haunted her. And then she'd glance at the shadow of the box beneath her bed. It wasn't just certificates inside. It was everything she had fought to earn, everything she refused to let fade. And so she carried it, day after day, through drills, marches, and inspections. It drew stares, whispers, laughter. But she knew what the others didn't. Sooner or later, the truth always revealed itself. What Claire didn't know was how soon. That moment would come, because while the recruits joked, the colonel had noticed. He'd heard whispers about the strange box, about the quiet woman who never responded. And unlike the others, he recognized something familiar in her silence. The moment was coming when laughter would be replaced by shock, when mockery would turn into respect. And when that latch finally opened, the rusted ammo box would speak louder than any insult ever could. For now, though, Claire endured the whispers. She shouldered the weight, not just of the box, but of the discipline it represented. Every sneer, every joke, every sideways glance became fuel. Because Claire knew something these recruits didn't. True strength doesn't shout. It waits. It watches. And it strikes only when necessary. And so, day by day, the legend of the rusted ammo box grew not in admiration, but in ridicule. They saw a relic. She carried a legacy. Soon, they would learn the difference. By the end of the second week, the box wasn't just a curiosity. It had become the recruits' favorite subject of ridicule. Every meal, every drill, every quiet moment in the barracks seemed to circle back to Claire and the battered green. Case she guarded with silent loyalty. It began small, harmless in their eyes. A whispered joke during chow. A smirk exchanged when she placed the box neatly at her side. But like most things among restless young recruits, it grew. The box transformed into an unspoken challenge, an invitation to poke, prod, and tease until they got a reaction. But Claire never gave them one. Her silence was infuriating. For people who thrived on validation, it was unsettling to face someone who refused to play along. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't laugh awkwardly. She didn't even sigh. She simply went about her duties with precise, almost mechanical calm. To them, it looked like weakness. To Claire, it was discipline carved by fire. The more she ignored them, the harder they pushed. One evening in the mess hall, Peters, the same lanky recruit who'd first mocked her, slid his tray across from hers, flashing a grin. "So, what's it gonna be today, Sergeant Mystery? You gonna feed us a clue, or keep us guessing forever?" His friends snickered. "Maybe she keeps snacks in there." "Nah, it's probably full of romance novels. Or grandma's knitting supplies." Claire ate silently, methodically. She chewed slowly, swallowed, then set her fork down. For a brief moment, her eyes met Peter's. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, cool as stone. Peters felt the weight of it and looked away, but he covered his discomfort with laughter. The others laughed too, but deep down, that brief stare unsettled them. Still, the jokes continued. The barracks buzzed with theories. One night, a group huddled near Peter's bunk, spinning stories like kids around a campfire. I heard she keeps love letters in there from some officer. No way, it's gotta be cash. She's hiding money. Maybe dog tags. Maybe she's carrying someone else's past. Laughter followed each guess, but the whispers carried an edge of unease. Because beneath the jokes lingered a question none dared ask out loud. What if they were wrong? Even Sergeant Miller noticed the growing fixation. He saw the way recruits pointed and whispered, the way their eyes darted to the box whenever Claire entered a room. He didn't intervene, not yet. Sometimes, soldiers needed to learn their own lessons the hard way. For Claire, each day felt like déjà vu. She'd lived through this before, though in different uniforms, on different soil. Quiet soldiers were always targets. But she had long ago decided never to defend herself with words. Words faded. Proof endured. And so she carried on. During PT, she left the box at the edge of the field, where it sat like a silent observer, while the recruits sweated through push-ups and sprints. They joked that it was her personal cheerleader. During weapons drills, she set it down by the firing line, its dented metal sides catching the sun. They laughed that it looked like it might crumble before she did. One afternoon, after a grueling run, Peters bent over, panting, and tapped the lid with his boot. "Careful, Claire. This thing looks like tetanus, waiting to happen." His words drew chuckles, but Miller's sharp whistle cut them short. The sergeant barked at Peters to get back in formation, yet even discipline couldn't erase the smirk on his face. Claire noticed, but she didn't react. At night, lying in her bunk, she listened to the whispers echoing across the dark barracks. They thought she was asleep, but her ears caught every word. The box had become folklore. Half jokes, half myths, woven by kids who hadn't yet seen war. What they didn't know, what none of them could know, was that inside rested her entire military life. Certificates laminated not for vanity, but for survival. Proof of years at Fort Benning, weeks of sniper school where failure meant washing out. Proof that she had spent days lying motionless in the dirt, breathing through her teeth to avoid detection. Proof that she had already walked the razor's edge of combat while they were still filling out college applications. The irony. Burned, but she let it. Because patience, she knew, was the sharpest weapon. Still, there were moments when her silence drew more than ridicule. Some recruits began watching her differently. A few wondered why she never cracked. One night, after lights out, a soft voice whispered across the bunks, "Hey, Claire, is it something important?" She didn't answer. She couldn't, because once she opened that door, even slightly, it would all come spilling out. And she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The ridicule, however, continued to mount. Peters, emboldened by her silence, pushed harder. He mimicked her walk, pretending to drag an imaginary box. He gave fake speeches, parodying her quietness. Each time, the barracks erupted with laughter. Claire endured it, eyes forward, jaw set. But Sergeant Miller was watching. And so was the colonel. Because while recruits saw only a box, the colonel saw something else. A soldier who didn't flinch. A soldier who carried weight literal and invisible without complaint. He didn't know yet what was inside, but he knew enough to trust his instincts. And so, as the weeks stretched on, the tension built. Every joke added to the pressure. Every laugh made the reveal inevitable. Claire knew it. The colonel sensed it. Even the recruits, deep down, felt it. They thought they were in control of the joke. But soon, they would realize the joke had been on them all along. Because one day, that rusted ammo box would open. And when it did, silence would finally fall. A Georgia sun was merciless that afternoon. Heat shimmered off the gravel parade ground, baking the recruits as they lined up for weapons drills. Sweat streaked down their necks, soaking into fatigues already stiff from dust and salt. The cadence of Sergeant Miller's barked commands echoed across the field, snapping them into focus. But even as rifles were checked and positions adjusted, all eyes couldn't help drifting toward the same familiar sight. Claire's rusted ammo box, resting beside her boots like a loyal companion. By now, the box had become part of her identity. Wherever Claire went, it followed across the training field, into the mess hall, along the endless miles of PT runs. It sat quietly, dented and scarred, but always present, always guarded. Recruits had grown bold in their ridicule, but beneath the laughter simmered something else. Anticipation. Each passing day made the mystery heavier. They didn't just want to mock her anymore. They wanted answers. That was the atmosphere when the colonel appeared. His presence was like a sudden drop in temperature. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Boots snapped to attention. Even Miller's voice softened, respect threading through his usual drill sergeant bark. The colonel was not a man to be taken lightly. Every line on his weathered face carried weight. Every measured step reminded them that he had walked through wars they only read about in textbooks. He scanned the field slowly, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Nothing escaped him. Not the recruit with sloppy stance. Not the one nervously shifting his weight. And certainly not Claire, standing silent, the battered ammo box at her side. He stopped. The field seemed to hold its breath. "What's in that box, Private?" the colonel asked, his voice even but commanding. The recruits froze. They had joked about this moment, imagined it in whispers during late-night barracks chatter. But to hear the colonel himself, it sent a thrill down their spines. Some expected Claire to finally squirm. Others hoped for embarrassment, maybe even punishment. After all, no one hauled around junk on a military base without consequences. Claire didn't flinch. Her posture remained perfect, rifle slung neatly, boots aligned. For the briefest second, she considered how easy it would be to deflect, too. Mutter some excuse and move on. But she also knew this moment was different. This wasn't Peter's jeering in the mess hall. This was the colonel. And with him, respect demanded truth. She opened her mouth, but the colonel lifted a hand, stopping her. "No, don't explain," he said, voice low but carrying. "Open it." The order landed like a hammer. Every recruit leaned forward slightly, hearts pounding despite the heat. Peters couldn't hide the grin tugging at his lips. This was it, the grand reveal. He pictured crumpled letters, maybe a stash of candy bars, or some sentimental trinket that would finally justify weeks of mockery. Others imagined worse, a violation of regulation, something to get her chewed out publicly. Claire knelt slowly. She reached down, her fingers brushing over the warm, rusted surface. The latch, stiff from years of wear, creaked under her touch. For a moment, the only sound was the cicadas screaming in the nearby trees and the faint shuffle of boots as recruits shifted with anticipation. She didn't rush. Inside, her thoughts were steady, controlled. This was not fear. Fear had visited her long ago, on nights when she lay hidden in foreign soil, with her rifle aimed at shadowy figures. No, this was simply inevitability. The colonel had asked, and she would comply. The box had always been destined to open. It was just a matter of when. She flipped the latch. The metal groaned, snapping the recruit's focus tighter than ever. Peters leaned forward unconsciously, eyes gleaming. A hush rolled across the field, so deep that even Sergeant Miller, usually quick to cut tension, remained silent. Claire lifted the lid. But instead of immediately revealing the contents, she paused. She looked up, straight into the colonel's eyes, as if silently asking whether he truly wished to proceed. The colonel gave the smallest of nods. That was enough. She reached inside. The recruits craned their necks, desperate. A bead of sweat slid down Peter's cheek, but he didn't notice. His whole world had shrunk to that rusted box. Claire's hand emerged, not with candy, not with letters, not with contraband, but with a neatly laminated certificate. She held it up, expression unreadable, and extended it to the colonel. He took it. Silence deepened. The colonel's eyes scanned the document, his jaw tightening. After a long pause, he read aloud, United States Army Sniper School Fort. Benning, certified with distinction. The words hit like gunfire. Murmurs rippled through the ranks. Peter's grin evaporated. A recruit near the end of the line whispered, "No way." Another swallowed hard, suddenly remembering every cruel joke they had tossed at her. But the colonel wasn't finished. He reached into the box himself now, pulling out another certificate and then another. Advanced marksmanship, reconnaissance, proficiency, qualifications that spoke of grueling training and near-perfect performance. Each one bore the same name, Claire Matthews. The recruits stood stunned, their earlier smirks replaced by disbelief. The colonel turned slowly, holding the certificates high enough for all to see. "Does anyone else here carry credentials like this?" he asked, his voice cold, cutting through the thick silence. No one answered. Claire stood motionless, her expression calm, though inside she felt a faint, quiet relief. Not pride had no place here, but relief, because the box no longer needed to be shielded by silence. Its truth had been spoken. The colonel studied her for a moment, then returned the certificates carefully to the box. He closed the lid with deliberate care, as if sealing something sacred. Then he straightened, his gaze sweeping across the stunned recruits. "Remember this moment," he said. "Not everything is as it seems. And not everyone wears their strength on their sleeve." No one laughed. No one dared. For the first time since she had arrived, Claire felt the weight of silence shift. It no longer pressed against her. It pressed against them. The recruits who had mocked her most now couldn't meet her eyes. Their ridicule had crumbled, replaced by something heavier. Respect laced with shame. The rusted ammo box sat at her feet, unchanged, battered, and scarred as ever. But in the eyes of those around her, it was no longer a joke. It was proof. Proof of nights endured, battles fought, and skills earned through fire and discipline. And though she said nothing, though her lips never curved into the smallest smile, Claire knew one truth above all. Silence had won. The colonel's words still lingered in the hot afternoon air, carried on the silence of stunned recruits who suddenly found their boots far more interesting than their neighbor's smirk. Claire stood tall, her hands resting at her sides, eyes fixed forward. She wasn't seeking praise. She wasn't looking for vindication. But the shift in the air was unmistakable. Sergeant Miller, who had been watching the whole exchange with folded arms, finally allowed himself a faint grunt of satisfaction. He had known something was different about her. The calm, the discipline, the way she endured ridicule without a flicker of reaction. It wasn't the behavior of a rookie. It was the behavior of someone who had already walked a harder road. The colonel didn't stop with one certificate. He knelt beside the rusted box, his weathered fingers flipping through the stack inside. Each document was laminated, the edges sealed to protect against dirt and weather. He read them with the same intensity one might reserve for a classified briefing. "Advanced marksmanship," he muttered, holding one up to the light. "Reconnaissance proficiency. Foreign deployment. Credentials." He paused at another, brow furrowing before the faintest trace of a smile ghosted across his face. Near-perfect sniper qualification scores. The recruits shifted uneasily in formation. Some darted glances at Claire, but most kept there. Eyes locked straight ahead, unwilling to be caught staring. Every line the colonel read was another blow to their pride. The quiet woman with the junk box had quietly amassed a record most of them would never come close to achieving. Finally, the colonel straightened, box in hand. He walked back to Claire, his boots crunching on the gravel, and held her gaze. "Private Matthews," he said, voice steady. "Where did you serve before this assignment?" Claire's eyes remained forward, but her voice was clear, carrying easily over the silent formation. "2 deployments, sir. Attached to a reconnaissance. Unit overseas. Operational role. Sniper support." The words were delivered without embellishment, without hesitation. Just facts. No one in the formation missed the weight behind them. Overseas, recon, sniper. For Peters, the reality struck hardest. Every insult, every sneer, every childish joke he had lobbed at her replayed in his mind. He felt suddenly small, his earlier bravado shrinking under the weight of her truth. He had mocked someone who had already lived through what he was still training to survive. The colonel studied her a moment longer, then gave a single curt nod. It was not exaggerated, not theatrical, but for those who understood military culture, that nod meant more than applause. It was acknowledgement, respect granted from someone who did not give it lightly. The recruits felt it too. Respect wasn't just earned, it was validated. And Claire had just been validated at the highest level. "Carry on," the colonel said finally, returning the certificates to the box and snapping the latch closed. He set it down at Claire's feet with deliberate care, as though it were something sacred. Then, turning back to the recruits, he addressed them. "Young soldiers," he began, his voice cutting sharp as steel, "take note. Strength isn't always loud. The ones who talk the most are rarely the ones who've done the most. This woman has carried herself with discipline while you mocked her. She's walked roads you haven't even seen on a map. And she never once tried to impress you with words." His eyes swept across the rows of stunned faces. "You do well to learn from that." No one dared breathe too loudly. When the colonel finally walked off, his shadow shrinking across the sun-baked gravel, the recruits remained frozen. It was Miller who broke the silence. "Back to work," he barked, though his voice carried a trace of pride. The formation snapped. Back into motion, but the rhythm was different now. No one looked at Claire with laughter in their eyes. No one nudged their buddy to whisper a joke. The ammo box, once the object of mockery, now sat like a silent sentinel at her feet. And for the first time, not a single recruit dared touch it. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. Normally, evenings brought a buzz of chatter, stories swapped between bunks, the occasional round of teasing that echoed into the dark. But after the day's events, conversation slowed. Peters lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. Across the room, others avoided even glancing at Claire. She sat calmly at the edge of her bed, polishing her boots, the ammo box at her side. The faint scrape of cloth on leather was the only sound she made. Eventually, one recruit broke the silence. His voice was low, tentative. "Matthews, why didn't you say anything?" Claire looked up, her expression unreadable. She considered the question, then shrugged lightly. "Didn't need to." The answer was simple. To her, the truth had never required explanation. It was always there, waiting for the right moment. The recruits exchanged uneasy glances, the sting of shame settling deeper. They had spent weeks ridiculing someone who embodied everything they were supposed to aspire to: discipline, patience, skill. Even Peters, usually so quick with a quip, found his voice gone. He rolled over, pulling the thin blanket to his chin, trying to sleep off the regret, gnawing at his gut. For Claire, the day had changed little. She hadn't carried the box for validation. She hadn't kept her silence for dramatic effect. She had simply been herself, a soldier who knew that true strength didn't demand recognition. Still, there was a subtle shift inside her. The colonel's nod had been brief, but it meant something. It meant she wasn't entirely invisible. It meant her past was seen, acknowledged, respected. And for the first time since arriving at the base, she allowed herself the smallest exhale of relief. The box sat under her bunk as the barracks lights dimmed, its rusted surface catching faint glimmers from the overhead bulbs. To the recruits, it was no longer a punchline. It was a reminder, a warning, a lesson carved into dented steel. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The day after the colonel revealed Claire's credentials, the atmosphere on base felt different. It wasn't something you could measure, like the cadence of drills or the weight of a pack. It was subtler, a shift in tone, in glances, in silence. The rusted ammo box still rested at Claire's side, but it no longer carried the sting of ridicule. Now, it carried weight, like a banner none of the recruits dared question. Morning formation was unusually quiet. Normally, whispers buzzed in. The line complaints about sore muscles, jokes about breakfast rations, even the occasional jab at Claire and her magic box. But this time, not a word. When Sergeant Miller barked the command to attention, every boot slammed down in unison, sharper than usual, as if the recruits were trying to redeem themselves through precision. Claire, as always, stood silent. She had no desire to gloat, no urge to remind anyone of their past cruelty. If anything, she wanted less attention, not more. Her military life had taught her that recognition could be dangerous, even deadly. Pride made people sloppy. Pride got people killed. Later that morning, the colonel returned not for an inspection, not for a speech, but with a quiet purpose. He called Claire forward. The recruits straightened, curiosity pulling at their thoughts like magnets. "Private Matthews," the colonel said, his voice steady, "you mentioned deployments?" "Where?" Claire met his eyes briefly before answering. Her words were clipped, professional, stripped of embellishment. "Afghanistan, sir. Twice. Reconnaissance support, sniper qualified, attached to 4 operating units." A ripple passed through the recruits. Afghanistan wasn't a classroom scenario. It wasn't training in the safety of U.S. soil. It was dust, fire, and uncertainty. The weight of it sank into them. This woman, this quiet, older recruit they had mocked, had stood in the dirt of a battlefield while they were still glued to their phones back home. The colonel studied her closely. Operational role? Claire's answer was simple. Overwatch, target suppression, protective coverage for reconnaissance teams, standard assignments. There was nothing boastful in her tone. She didn't exaggerate or dramatize. She spoke like she was reporting the weather, but the simplicity made it heavier. Standard assignments for her were the kind of missions these recruits only saw in news footage or movies. The colonel gave a single nod. Understood. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the recruits before returning to her. "And now you're here." "Yes, sir." The recruits wanted more. They wanted stories, details, the kind of blood and thunder Taylor's soldiers sometimes shared in hushed tones after lights out. But Claire gave none. She wasn't here to entertain them. She wasn't here to relive what she had endured. The colonel didn't press. Instead, he turned back to the formation. "You mocked her because you didn't understand her. You ridiculed what you couldn't explain. That is a weakness. Learn from it. In this profession, underestimating someone is not just a mistake, it can be fatal." You thought she was hiding. In truth, she has already carried more than you have begun to imagine. His words hung in the air, heavy and immovable. For the recruits, guilt settled like lead in their stomachs. Peters especially felt it. His jokes, his mocking impressions, his smug confidence, all of it collapsed in the face of truth. He remembered every time Claire had walked past with her box, silent and steady, while he made her the target of laughter. The Shane gnawed at him. After the colonel dismissed them, training resumed, but the energy was different. On the firing line, eyes kept flicking toward Claire, not with derision this time, but with something closer to awe. Her posture was flawless, her movements precise. When she adjusted her sights, it was smooth, practiced, efficient. Even her breathing seemed measured, deliberate. Miller, who had always kept a sharp eye on his recruits, noticed the shift. He caught the way some lingered near Claire, hesitating as though they wanted to ask questions, but didn't know how. He saw Peter's stealing glances, his usual arrogance stripped bare. The box had changed everything. During a break, one recruit finally mustered the courage. "Matthews, could you, maybe, help me with my stance?" The words were clumsy. Hesitant, but sincere, Claire looked at him. For a moment, she considered brushing it off, but then she nodded. "You're leaning too far forward. Shift your weight back. Let your shoulders do the work, not your wrists." The recruit adjusted. His next shot landed closer to center mass. His eyes widened. "Better," Claire said simply, before stepping back. Others began asking, cautiously at first, then more openly. Each time, Claire offered quiet corrections, never harsh, never proud, just efficient. She didn't lecture, she didn't brag, she showed. And the results spoke louder than anything else. By evening, the ammo box had become more than a container of certificates. It was a symbol, a reminder of her credibility. When it sat beside her at the range, the recruits no longer smirked. They stood straighter, listened harder, tried to mirror her discipline. That night, in the barracks, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of shame anymore. It was the silence of reflection. Recruits lay in their bunks, thinking about the day's revelations, about the colonel's words, about the quiet strength they had mocked for weeks. Peters, lying awake, finally whispered into the dark, "Matthews, I was wrong." The words were barely audible, but Claire heard them. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Apologies weren't her goal. Growth was. As she lay back, the ammo box under her bed, Claire felt the weight of the past weeks lifting slightly. Not gone, the box would always carry its own burden, but lighter. For the first time since arriving, she wasn't just enduring. She was being seen. The colonel's nod had been brief, but it was enough. In the military, acknowledgement carried more value than applause. Respect, once earned, was unshakable. And Claire had earned it the hardest way possible, through silence, patience, and truth. The sun rose heavy and orange over the training grounds, casting long shadows across the gravel as the recruits assembled for another day. The rhythm of life at the base didn't pause for revelations. Drills were drills. Targets still needed hitting. Boots still had to march in time. Yet beneath the routine, something had shifted. Claire felt it before she even reached formation. Eyes followed her differently now. No one jeered when she carried the rusted ammo box. No one dared whisper. Where there had once been derision, now there was quiet curiosity, cautious respect. Sergeant Miller noticed too. He stood with his usual no-nonsense posture, but the corner of his mouth twitched faintly as he watched his recruits steal glances at the woman they had mocked for weeks. Miller didn't say anything, but in his mind, Claire had just become one of his strongest teaching tools. Not because he planned to use her, but because she had proven something no lecture could drive home. Strength often wears silence as armor. The morning began with endurance drills, long runs under the rising sun. rifles strapped across shoulders, sweat soaking through fatigues. The recruits panted and stumbled, but Claire ran with a steady pace, her breath measured, her stride unbroken. Halfway through the circuit, Peters began to falter. His bravado had always masked the fact that his endurance wasn't the best. Normally, he would crack a joke to hide it, laughing through the pain. But today, no jokes came. He dropped back, gasping, his rifle bouncing against his side. Claire noticed. She didn't slow her own pace, but as she passed him, she muttered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Steady your breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Don't fight the pain, pace it." Peters blinked, startled, but obeyed. To his surprise, it worked. The cramp in his side eased slightly. His rhythm steadied. He didn't thank her, not yet, but the lesson stuck. Later, at the firing range, the recruits lined up for precision drills. Targets were set farther back than usual, the kind that revealed every flaw in form and discipline. Miller barked his commands, but it was Claire who drew the most attention. She adjusted her rifle with practiced efficiency, settling into position like it was second nature. When she fired, the shot rang sharp and clean, the bullet piercing dead center. The recruits couldn't help themselves. They watched. Shot after shot landed true. It wasn't luck, it was mastery. One of the younger recruits finally broke the silence. "Matthews, how do you keep it that steady?" Claire lowered her rifle, glancing at him. For a moment, she said nothing, letting him squirm under the weight of her quiet. Then she answered in her calm, steady tone. "Control the small things. Your grip, your breathing, your focus. Don't rush. The bullet will follow your discipline." The recruit nodded, trying to mimic her posture. His shot landed closer to the center than before. A small victory, but it mattered. Word spread quickly across the line. One by one, recruits asked her for advice. She never sought them out, never boasted, never lectured. But when asked, she corrected. A shift of the elbow here, a reminder to exhale slowly there. Her voice was always low, steady, free of judgment. Even Miller noticed. Normally, he would snap at recruits for seeking advice outside his orders. But this time, he let it happen. He saw the way they leaned in when Claire spoke, the way their shots improved under her subtle guidance. He wasn't losing authority. If anything, he was gaining it through her. By the afternoon, the transformation was undeniable. Claire had become an unspoken mentor, not by force, not by title, simply by being herself. Peters, however, struggled the most. His pride, once so inflated, now lay in shards. He watched Claire from the corner of his eye, torn between resentment and admiration. He remembered every cruel joke he'd made, every time he'd called her box junk, every laugh at her expense. And now, here she was steadier, stronger, more disciplined than any of them. During a break, he finally approached her. His words caught in his throat, but he forced them out. "Matthews, can you check my stance?" The request felt like swallowing glass, but he meant it. Claire studied him for a long moment. Peters shifted uneasily, expecting rejection. But finally, she nodded. "You're locking your shoulder. Too tight. Loosen it. Let the recoil work with you, not against you." Peters adjusted. His next shot landed closer to the target's heart. Not perfect, but better. He lowered the rifle, staring at the result in silence. "Better," Claire said, echoing the same simple word she'd given others. Then she turned away, already focused on cleaning her rifle. Peters stood there a long moment, humbled. 4. The first time, he realized how much he had underestimated her and himself. That evening, the barracks were filled with murmurs. Recruits talked quietly about Claire's advice, about how their aim had improved, about how she made it look effortless. No one dared mock her anymore. The ammo box under her bunk was no longer a joke. It was a legend in the making. Some even speculated what else might be inside: medals, commendations, mission logs. But Claire never volunteered details. The mystery only deepened the respect. As lights dimmed, Peters found himself staring at the ceiling again. But this time, his thoughts weren't filled with guilt alone. They were filled with determination. If Claire could carry herself with such strength, after everything she had endured, maybe he could be better too. Maybe all of them could. For Claire, the day ended as it always did, with quiet. She didn't bask in their newfound respect. She didn't dwell on the shift in their behavior. She simply polished her boots, checked her rifle, and slid the rusted ammo box back into place beneath her bunk. The box wasn't her identity. It wasn't her trophy. It was her reminder. A reminder of what she had survived. A reminder of what discipline meant. A reminder that silence, when backed by truth, was stronger than any roar. And as she lay down, the base finally settling into stillness, Claire allowed herself a thought she hadn't considered before. Maybe her presence here wasn't just about enduring the training again. Maybe it was about teaching these young recruits, without ever saying so, that strength isn't found in mockery or noise. It's found in patience, in discipline, in resilience. The box was no longer a burden. It was a gift. Night fell over the training grounds like a thick blanket, the sky ink black except for scattered stars. The recruits gathered in formation, shadows long and heavy under the sparse floodlights. This drill was different. Not just another range exercise or endurance run. Tonight, it was a simulation of a real-world scenario. Reconnaissance and target engagement under darkness, with limited visibility, nerves taut, and mistakes magnified. Claire stepped forward, her rusted ammo box in tow, placing it carefully. By the edge of the staging area, the recruits, still adjusting to her quiet authority, eyed it almost reverently. To them, it was no longer a joke. It was a talisman, a silent reminder of the skill and discipline they had previously dismissed. The colonel arrived quietly, observing from the perimeter. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone added pressure, and he could see the transformation. Among the recruits, they were no longer the same group that had mocked Claire weeks ago. They were tense, cautious, but also alert, aware that the lessons of the past days were now their survival tools. The drill began. Targets were scattered throughout the tree line, and each recruit had to navigate through uneven terrain, identify and engage their objective, and return safely to base all under the cloak of darkness. Mistakes would be costly. Almost immediately, the recruits began faltering. One stumbled over a tree root, another misread a sight line, and the tension grew palpable. Claire moved silently through the line, observing. She didn't speak unless necessary, but her presence itself was a stabilizing force. Peters was struggling. His nerves, once hidden under arrogance, betrayed him now. His hands shook as he checked his weapon, the darkness amplifying every sound, every rustle of leaves. He remembered the weeks of mockery, the laughter at her ammo box, the jokes at her expense. Now, for the first time, he understood the weight of real responsibility. He was out of his depth. Claire approached him without a word. She knelt slightly, to meet his eye level, her calm, measured voice cutting through the tension. Feet shoulder width. Breathe slow. Scan the terrain, not the target first. You're not firing yet. Wait for the right moment. Peters nodded, swallowing hard, trying to mimic her posture. The difference was immediate. His next move was smoother. His aim steadied. His confidence returned not in bravado, but in technique. Across the field, other recruits began mimicking her methods instinctively. She didn't lecture, she didn't force it, but every adjustment she made was observed and replicated. She was a silent instructor, her actions more compelling than any verbal command. As the night deepened, the real challenge arrived. The final set of targets was hidden behind dense foliage, requiring both stealth and precision. Mistakes now would mean failure for the group. The recruits moved carefully, whispering instructions to each other. Claire's guidance was subtle but crucial. Her hand gestures, soft taps, and quiet words directing them without revealing the depth of her experience. At one point, Peters froze. A faint rustle sounded to his right. He risked a glance, but saw nothing. Panic threatened to take over, but a hand on his shoulder steadied him. It was Claire. She whispered, "Focus, shadows are not threats. Your target is your priority. Move slowly." Her calmness was infectious. He followed her instructions and identified the hidden target without error. Relief washed over him, mixed with awe. He realized the depth of her skill and the reason the colonel had shown such respect. The exercise continued for hours, each recruit facing the dual pressures of fear and expectation. Claire was everywhere at once, correcting stance, whispering timing, signaling when to hold, when to advance. Her past experience transformed the night into a controlled, efficient operation. The recruits, who had once laughed at the box, now looked to her as their anchor. By the final target, every recruit had been guided by her. They executed the maneuver with near-perfect precision, the culmination of discipline, patience, and observation. The colonel, observing from a distance, allowed himself a rare smile. "Formation," he called once the drill concluded. The recruits returned to base, breathless, sweaty, but exhilarated. They lined up in formation, eyes forward, hands on their rifles, but glances occasionally flicked toward Claire. She didn't seek their praise. She simply stood, calm and composed, the ammo box at her side. Peters, finally breathing steadily, whispered under his breath, "I get it now. I really get it." The others nodded silently. They didn't need to speak. The lesson had been driven home. Skill, patience, and discipline could never be mocked. Later, in the quiet of the barracks, whispers turned to reflection. "She's incredible," one recruit murmured. "I can't believe we made fun of her." "She's different," another said, tone reverent. "Everything we mocked, she's proved it's worth more than we imagined." Even Sergeant Miller allowed the room to settle, letting them digest the night's events. He didn't lecture, didn't reprimand. The lesson had been delivered perfectly by the person they had underestimated. The rusted ammo box sat in the corner, unassuming yet profound. No one dared touch it. It had become more than medal and certificates. It was a symbol of what they had once failed to recognize. True strength, earned through experience, endurance, and quiet determination. That night, as the barracks settled into darkness, Peters stayed awake longer than most. He traced the scratches on his own rifle, thinking back to Claire's every instruction, every movement. The weight of his past arrogance pressed heavily, but so did the resolve to improve. He realized that the woman he had mocked had just shown him, and all the others, what it meant to be a soldier, not just in skill, but in character. Claire, meanwhile, allowed herself a small, private acknowledgement of satisfaction. Not pride, not vanity, but quiet affirmation. The drill had been a success. Not because she had proven her credentials again, they already spoke for themselves, but because the recruits had learned, by necessity, what she had silently taught all along. Respect isn't given. It is earned quietly through action. The ammo box, dented and rusted, lay under her bunk as she prepared for sleep. It had seen laughter, ridicule, and disbelief. Tonight, it carried a new weight, admiration. For the first time in weeks, she felt the shift in the recruits, not just as acknowledgement, but as understanding. Outside, the night was still. The training grounds were empty, except for the faint hum of insects and the distant call of a night bird. Inside, lessons had been absorbed, respect earned, and arrogance dissolved. Claire had not raised her voice, had not demanded acknowledgement, had not sought glory. She had simply been herself a soldier, disciplined, patient, and quietly formidable. And in that quiet, she had transformed not just the perception of her peers, but the course of their growth as soldiers. The day of graduation dawned clear and sharp. The crisp morning air carried the scent of dew and earth, and the parade ground stretched wide under the rising sun. For weeks, it had been a crucible of heat, sweat, ridicule, and discipline. And now, it would be a moment of recognition, not just for Claire, but for the transformation of every recruit who had trained alongside her. Claire stood at attention, her rusted ammo box beside her, just as it had been for weeks. To the untrained eye, it looked ordinary. Battered metal, scratches etched like faint scars. But for anyone who had seen the journey, it was a testament proof of endurance, skill, and quiet strength. The colonel arrived with his usual measured stride, observing the formation. His eyes swept over the recruits, lingering briefly on Claire. She returned his gaze, unflinching. In that silent exchange, a mutual understanding passed between them, respect, earned, recognized, and unwavering. The ceremony began. Recruits were called forward, one by one, receiving their marks, certificates, and the approval of the commanding officers. When Claire's name was called, a quiet ripple passed through the formation. No one laughed. No one whispered. Every eye followed her as she stepped forward, maintaining perfect posture, steady breathing, and an expression calm yet commanding. The colonel handed her the ceremonial certificate, a final acknowledgement of her training, skill, and leadership. Unlike others, Claire didn't raise her voice or smile broadly. She simply accepted it, eyes forward, movements precise. The weight of the moment rested not on her expression, but on her presence, the silent authority she had earned over the weeks. As she returned to formation, whispers finally broke the long-held tension. Peters, standing near the back, shook his head, unable to find words that could encompass what he felt. The recruits who had mocked her weeks ago now looked at her with awe. They had seen her skill tested, her patience unwavering, and her guidance shaping their abilities. Every ridicule they had once felt was now replaced by respect hard-earned and undeniable. Sergeant Miller allowed a rare smile to cross his face. "She's taught you more than you realized," he said quietly to the recruits beside him. And she did it without a word wasted. The colonel stepped forward again, addressing the entire formation. Private Matthew's journey is a lesson to all of you, not in speed or brute strength or loudness, but in endurance, precision, and character. You may carry certificates, medals, or titles, but real strength is silent. Until the right moment, learn from it, respect it, emulate it. The recruits absorbed every word. Peters shifted on his feet, thinking back to every laugh, every joke, every moment he had mocked her box. Shame, yes, but also resolve. He would carry this lesson forward. He would not forget it. After the ceremony, the formation broke. Recruits moved to their bunks, collecting their belongings, but many lingered near Claire. They asked questions quietly, sought her advice, or simply walked beside her, trying to match her pace. She responded in the same calm, measured way she had throughout, never flaunting her knowledge, never lecturing, simply guiding through demonstration and quiet instruction. Later, alone for a brief moment, Claire knelt beside her rusted ammo box. She ran her hands over its surface, tracing each dent and scratch. It had carried her past, her achievements, and the silent respect of those who had underestimated her. Once, it had been a symbol of ridicule. Now, it was a monument to perseverance, discipline, and quiet victory. Peters approached, hesitating. "Matthews." His voice carried humility now, the weight of genuine acknowledgement. "I thank you for everything." She looked at him, expression unreadable, and simply nodded. That was all the acknowledgement she needed to offer. Words were never her measure. Actions spoke louder than any speech, and he had learned that lesson fully. The recruits lingered nearby, some shyly asking questions, others watching her with admiration. Claire guided them all in small ways, correcting a posture, adjusting a grip, or offering a subtle tip on breath control. Each interaction reinforced what they had learned during weeks of mockery, discipline, and finally, respect. By evening, the base was quieter. The recruits were tired, exhilarated, and reflective. Claire sat near the edge of the parade ground, her ammo box beside her. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon in hues of orange and red. The day had begun with ceremony, but it ended with quiet reflection. For Claire, that was always the ultimate measure of success. Not applause, not recognition, but the transformation of those around her. She thought of the colonel, who had seen her potential, understood her skill, and silently validated her journey. She thought of Peters and the other recruits who had mocked and doubted, only to learn the hard lessons of respect, patience, and humility. And she thought of the ammo box, dented and rusted, carrying the quiet weight of her story. Once, it had been an object of ridicule. Now, it was a testament. A monument to what could be achieved with discipline, endurance, and the courage to remain steady under scrutiny. As night fell completely, Claire finally allowed herself a moment of private acknowledgement. Not pride, not boastfulness, just quiet affirmation. She had endured ridicule. She had faced doubt. She had been tested, and she had emerged not just unbroken, but stronger, shaping the next generation of soldiers by example. The rusted ammo box rested at her side, silent, unassuming, and infinitely significant. It had carried her certificates, her past achievements, and the proof of her skill. It had endured mockery and misunderstanding, and in the end, it had witnessed the transformation of those who once laughed at it. Peters, sitting nearby, finally broke the silence, though softly. "We'll never forget this, Matthews." "None of us will," she nodded slightly, allowing the acknowledgement. Words were not necessary. They had already learned. The stars shone above the base, steady and unwavering, a quiet reminder of the lessons learned. Patience, discipline, and silent strength often outweigh noise, arrogance, and superficial judgments. And in that quiet night, with the ammo box beside her and the recruits around her, Claire realized that her journey had not just been about enduring the training, but about showing, without a word wasted, what it truly meant to be a soldier.